up right on time. We have a lot to get through and a lot of exciting things to hear about today. So I'd say, why don't we jump right in and get this show on the road. So first off, hi, my name is Ben Fowler. I'm a co-founder and principal at Aotearoa Associates. I'm also the program chair for the Social Impact Measurement Working Group of the American Evaluation Association. And I'm pleased to open the second webinar that we're hosting this year on applying developmental evaluation in new environments. So if we want to skip to the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about the SIM TIG in case it's something that you're not currently a member of and perhaps you're interested in knowing more about. We are a group of members who are interested in the topic of social impact measurement and management, coming from a range of different backgrounds. Some of us are evaluators, those commissioning evaluations, investors, investees, et cetera, et cetera. The SIM TIG is hosted by the American Evaluation Association, and we're always welcoming new members. So if this is something that you're interested in, please reach out to any of us. We can we've posted a link to our organizational page if you'd like to learn more, or you can reach out to any of us today who are hosting the event, and we'd love to tell you more about the organization and what we do. I'll also give a quick plug for some of the content we have coming up this year. Prior to the annual evaluation conference, which is happening November 8th to 12th, we have 2 webinars, of which this is the second. Last month, we hosted one on evaluation and impact washing, which I hope many of you were able to attend. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at developmental evaluation in new environments. Then we have a lot of exciting content that's happening at the evaluation conference itself. We have an annual meeting of the SIM TIG happening on the first day, the Monday, and that's at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. So for all of you who are in a time zone that's suitable to attending, we'd love to see you come. You don't have to be a member of AEA to attend our annual meeting, and it'll be a great chance to hear more about the kind of things we do as a group, get some updates on some latest developments in the field, and meet some of your colleagues who are also interested in this topic. We also have some other very exciting sessions happening. One that's happening on the Monday is around measuring impact performance, insights from 135 interviews with impact investors. We also have a session called Changing the Valuing Frameworks in Gender Lens Investment. And finally, we're hosting a session, Creative Ways to Evaluate the Social Impact of Investors and Businesses During a Global Economic Recession. So we'd very much invite you to join any and all of those sessions, should they be of interest to you. And we'll be sending out more information to our SIM TIG membership and all of those who are interested. So if you want to know more, please reach out and we're happy to tell you more about that. Finally, in December, following the end of the conference, we're going to circulate a newsletter that'll provide some snippets of some of the interesting topics that weren't able to be presented at the conference itself, but that we think are really add value to the field and that we want to share with you. So without any further ado, I'm quickly going to give you an introduction to today's speakers. I could talk for most of this hour just presenting on each one of them and their many achievements, but I know that you've come not only to know about them, but also about what they're going to speak about today. So I'm going to keep it very brief and let the speakers elaborate a little bit more should they choose. One of our speakers today is Karim Harji. He's the program director at the Oxford Impact Measurement Program at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, among many other hats that he wears. It's also notable that he's one of the co-founders of this SIM TIG. Another one of our presenters today is Penny Hawkins. She is an independent evaluation, monitoring, and learning consultant with a wide variety of experience in this space. Third, we have Heather Esper. She is a member of our SIM TIG leadership group. She's also a director of performance measurement and improvement at the William Davidson Institute. And then finally, we have Dominic Margiosa, who's the program associate at Social Impact. So with that, I'm really looking forward to turning this over. Just one housekeeping method or request rather. If you have questions today about the content being shared, kindly note it in the chat so that we can pick that up at the end of the chat. And please note prominently that it's a question in your notes so that we can quickly scan and make sure that it's presented to the speakers. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Ben. We're really excited to be here. On behalf of my co-presenters, we'd like to thank the Social Impact Measurement TIG at the American Evaluation Association for inviting us to present today. Today, we're going to explore the application of developmental evaluation in new environments. And one of those new environments is with market-based approaches and impact investing. Today, Karim and Penny will start by building off where Jane Reisman left the conversation during our last webinar, when she spoke of new norms that are shaping impact investing by bringing together principles and practices from the adjacent fields of evaluation and impact measurement and management. Developmental evaluation does exactly that by utilizing evaluation tools and methods to inform impact management. Next, Dom is going to share what we've learned from adapting DE in virtual environments over the past year and a half during the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, I'll briefly present some methods that can be used to assess the effectiveness of DE in new environments. So really quick, I would like to, here we go. We'd like to get a poll up and hear about how familiar people are with DE. So if you could answer that quickly. Have you ever heard of it? Not heard of it? Have you participated in a DE before? Or have you actually participated in more than one DE before? All right, we've got about 36 people answering, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we can see and share our results. So it looks like a large majority have heard of DE or participated in one. We do have a few people on the call today that haven't heard of it, so I will go over briefly a little bit about DE and what it is and isn't. Let me go ahead and stop sharing that. Okay. So what is developmental evaluation? Developmental evaluation is an evaluative approach aimed at facilitating the continuous adaptation of innovative interventions. It involves having one or more developmental evaluators integrated into the program team on a full-time or part-time basis to help guide adaptation to emergent and changes in complex environments. Developmental evaluators adjust evaluation questions, methods, and techniques using a range of evaluation methods as the project evolves to deliver emergent and contextualized utilization-focused findings on an ongoing basis. A developmental evaluator is likely to build relationships and become an advisor to DE participants while continuing to maintain a third-party perspective. In such cases, they often become an active member of the team's strategic adaptation and innovation. And these features make DE different from other forms of traditional evaluation. If DE is new to you, I'm going to paste a resource into the chat, but I'm going to turn it over to Karim and Penny now to share a little bit more about their work with DE and impact investing.
Great, thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Good to see both familiar faces and some new ones. So I'm Karim Harji. We've been working with Penny and our colleague Zazie with the Working Capital Supply Chain Innovation Fund. Some of you, I know were at our session last year. We'll reference that quite briefly. And I'll paste in the chat a few other references as we go. We'll provide a very quick introduction to the fund, situate the role of DE within the fund's work and our work with them, and then dive right into some of the ways in which we are taking the principles of DE and making them real in practice. Talk a little bit about what this looks like as part of our day-to-day with the fund team, and then some lessons and reflections around several years into this work. What are some of the things we now know that we didn't know before? And for those of you that are either starting or planning or doing DE, maybe some of this might be helpful or relevant as you dive into it. So to situate some of the work, and I'll use working capital as a shorthand for the fund, let me frame what the fund is trying to do. And in some ways, this is quite new because impact investing as a field is relatively new in its formalized sense. You may have heard from Jane and Veronica over our last few webinars around the ways in which impact investing is actually evolving as a field and the role of IMM, impact measurement and management within that. About 4 years ago, Humanity United, one of the partners from the Aotearoa network, created this $25 million VC fund, venture capital fund, really to look at technology solutions to prevent exploitation of workers in supply chains, but also to increase the transparency and traceability of products within supply chains. And the idea there was that by promoting transparency and traceability, and also using technology to identify and mitigate worker exploitation, that there's one part of the ecosystem approach around thinking about how workers can be better off or less worse off as a complement to other approaches such as philanthropy and regulation. This is the first time that a venture fund approach was deployed in this kind of area and sector. And as you'll see here on this slide, it fits very nicely into some of the ways in which DE is well suited for these kinds of interventions. It was a very complex ecosystem characterized by a lot of contestation and different kinds of actors, including corporates, tech firms, and workers, trying to test a new tool around capital in service of trying to not only make investments, but also build and catalyze an ecosystem. And then think about how you apply the very complex and multifaceted issues around impact within transactions, a portfolio structure, and then an ecosystem approach. So as you can see, this almost implies that simply having a set of standard metrics or KPIs isn't going to cut it. So for a whole bunch of reasons, these and more, I'll share the link that's at the bottom here in the chat shortly. There's a lot more detail on the site. We think that developmental evaluation was a really good fit. We started working with the firm or with the fund about 4 years ago and helping to frame what DE would mean in a market-based context. We'll share some of these lessons around our 4 years. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the Laudes Foundation, because they were not only one of the LPs within the fund, but also essentially underwrote part of the developmental evaluation to start with, and have been a strong supporter of the field building around applying developmental evaluation in different contexts. So just on the next slide, before I transition to Penny, Heather, if you can move one back, thank you. So this is maybe another shout out to our colleague, Laura Budzina, who's with us. She captured spontaneously some of the themes that came up at last year's AEA session. So I won't cover that. I think we have a recording available, but there we began to really talk about where developmental evaluation sat within this fund, some of the initial principles, and then touched on a couple of tools. So what we're going to do now is go a little bit deeper, and I'll hand it over to Penny to dive in.
Thanks very much, Karim. And hi, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm speaking from the future because it's Wednesday here. Good to be part of this. So as Karim said, we've been doing this for quite a while now. And last year we talked about why DE in this particular situation, what kinds of things are we contributing, and how are we going about this. So we're going to build on that now. So the primary purpose of this, if you think about the classic purposes in most evaluation of is it accountability, is it learning, this is definitely about learning. So learning both internally to the fund, but also externally. So part of our commitment here is to share what we're learning as we're doing now with both the impact investing field and the evaluation field. So, so for the fund plus the investees, so the early stage companies that the fund is supporting. So let me get this right. So principles into practice. So one of the first things we had to do, as with most evaluations, is develop a theory of change that would help to guide the development, the thinking, any kind of measurement that we were able to do, but also inform the fund itself in terms of its direction, where it was going, etc. So what we've done is developed a fund TOC, but we've also been working with investees. So the TOC applies both to the fund, and the investees have been developing their own TOCs with our support. In terms of the approach that we're taking, it is very much co-creation. So we couldn't approach this in a way that you would do with a classic evaluation. So design up front, implement. We're working very closely with the fund. We jointly reviewed the theory of change. We update it. I think I've lost count of which version we're on now. But as things are changing quickly, this is an innovative space. Things don't stay the same. So that constant review and updating has been necessary. We produce internal learning notes for the fund, and they respond to specific learning questions. So we started out with a usual set of questions that we address. We pick the ones that are relevant at the time, according to the learning needs at the time. So we've had a broad set of questions that cut right across. And the idea of the learning notes is to provide insights, provide feedback, provide information that can inform what happens next. So very dynamic and very close working, as you would expect in a developmental evaluation. So one of the critical things is that these feedback loops that we're providing information through has to be timely. It has to be produced at the right moment, feed in at the right moment. And so in a sense, we have to anticipate what's coming next and where we should focus our attention, where we should spend our time. And that's both for the fund and in working with the investees. So we developed a cadence, if you like, of regular meetings. Some of these are our own team meeting is weekly. We meet bi-weekly with the fund team. We have check-ins, specific check-ins when we need to. And we have monthly sessions that go deeper. And that's where a lot of the co-creation work might happen. So the monthly meetings are more strategic and deal with very critical issues. We're also producing annual reviews every 6 months or so, and we do those, we contribute to the fund's annual reviews. So I think with the investees, it might be worth saying something about that. So we're working with them to help them and support them develop their impact management and measurement capability. And so, you know, with that, we've got to think about, or they would be thinking about, what's the value of that? What are we going to get out of that? Is it going to help us with investments? Is it going to help us with sales? Is it going to enhance our brand? And in fact, is it actually going to motivate us to keep a good focus on impact and do the right things to enable us to get there? I think, Karim, this is you.
Yep, great, thanks. And so one of the things, for those of you that are familiar with the fund landscape or how venture capital works, you know, you mobilize a pool of capital, you deploy it, at least part of it, into a set of investments, and then you choose, in some cases, what investments you will follow on with. And fund timelines vary. And so there are some important differences between how programs are run, both philanthropic and public sector, as well as how these kinds of structures that are sometimes hybrid, but often like reflect a very private sector venture capital way of working that is not always common to evaluators. And so I'll briefly touch on a few of those areas and what it meant in practice. Penny's highlighted a few of those. So if you're familiar with DE, you know, one of the distinguishing factors is that you're playing multiple roles, and those roles vary over time. And so we've listed here the insider, intermediary, and outsider roles. What that means is that insider roles, you're really part of the team, obviously requires a lot of trust building, frequent engagement, and the ability to be both honest and collegial and providing feedback and engaging. So you're basically working as part of the team. At the other end, we're independent evaluators. And so we can step back, in some cases, reflect on things in a fairly objective manner, or hold a mirror up, share what we're seeing outside of the fund, bring that back in. And then there's this intermediary function where we are sense making together, asking some of the so what and what else and now what type questions that we're all familiar with. In some cases, our team members, so there's 3 of us on the team, we can take different roles as insiders or outsiders. And then in some cases, we collectively will play the insider role versus the outsider role. So it just implies a very different way of working. It's not particularly intuitive if you're only playing one of those roles or you're used to playing one of those roles. And so that's one of the things maybe for evaluators to develop the capabilities around understanding what blend of facilitation skills, technical skills, and then subject matter expertise you need to be able to play all of these roles well. One of the other lessons is, or ways of working, was trying to think about where impact shows up at all of the investment processes and reporting. And there's multiple phases around how a fund like this comes together. Up front, you are setting a thesis, which we may understand as a theory of change. That can get refined and evolve over time. Then you're deploying capital into investments through a structured process of screening investments, going deeper around due diligence, and then making decisions and perhaps attaching some conditions around what investments for the investments that you're making. Sometimes those conditions are financial and other times they're impact. And so part of our role has been to map each part of the process, think about where impact considerations may naturally pop up or where they need to be quite explicitly discussed, and then think about the set of guiding questions and tools along the way. So in some sense, there's a front end piece of work during transactions. Those are quite structured. And then, as Penny mentioned, as part of our meetings on a quarterly, semi-annual basis, we do reviews both of the transactions as well as portfolio and what we're learning. One of the things that's helpful, again, when you are building a team in a market-based approach, is to have a degree of financial or investment knowledge as part of your team, because sometimes some of the terms that might be unfamiliar, it's important to get a sense of that, but also some of the pressures and timelines. Those can look quite different from programmatic interventions. Maybe a couple of other points just to round us out on this in terms of the differences with market-based approaches and maybe more classic philanthropic or public sector, is how you might develop a learning agenda. Compared to perhaps philanthropic programs, as an example, learning agendas are quite driven, let's say, by a foundation or by an ecosystem goal. In this case, you might have to respond to specific transactions, how the market for a technology or a set of solutions is evolving. So sometimes both the external environment as well as the internal environment is quite different. One thing that is noticeable that's quite different from our experience in public sector engagements is the feedback loop that Penny mentioned. Timeline is quite short. So you're always thinking about what are you observing? How can you test more quickly? What are ways to apply some of the learning you might have gained? And that, again, can feel in some cases both very quick, but it's also quite refreshing because you're forced to think about what you're learning and adapt it and apply it in real time. In some cases, you can plan for that when you're doing these regular reviews. In other cases, when deals or transactions have to close at a fairly tight timeline, you have to be quite responsive and reactive. And so again, that's perhaps something to develop as a capability, is the ability to both be thoughtful about designing this annual cycle of events, but also being able to have flexibility to be reactive when transactions are closing. And then I would say finally that the last point here around supporting development of MEL capabilities, this takes a whole range of forms. We'll share some of the information in the chat as well, where we found even through COVID, we were able to work with a range of individual investees to, in some cases, deepen their thinking around impact, in other cases, integrate it across their organization, in other cases, think about new opportunities where impact can be a differentiator as these companies think about how they will navigate the crisis. So I think there are lots of advantages to having the toolkit that we have as evaluators, but applying them in a market-based context sometimes means that it might look and feel a little bit different than you're used to. So over to Penny now for rounding us out around some of our reflections and lessons.
Yes, and of course, we've had a lot of opportunities for learning as evaluators through all of this. So, you know, if we knew then what we know now, what would, well, we may have done some things different, but I'll just go through some key things that we've learned during this process. So we started out thinking that we could follow an evaluation plan. You know, a classic evaluation, you would design, plan, and implement. We did develop a plan, and that plan didn't stay the same for very long. So we've had numerous plans now, and we keep updating our plan. Fortunately, we're working with a very enlightened client who not only sees the value of DE, but understands and appreciates the fact that DE is a dynamic process, doesn't stay the same. So we've been able to, without any difficulty really, to update the plan that we've got. And the context within which all this is happening, Karim's talked about market in which the ventures are operating. It's very dynamic, particularly in this innovation space. So everything's changing in response to that, which of course makes evaluation impact management measurement pretty challenging. Added to that, we've been working through the last 18 months with the COVID situation. So at times, even though we've had a plan, the dynamism has meant that it's been actually at times quite challenging to keep across everything that's changing. And so, you know, we do try and do that, but there's so much happening, it's a challenge. Initially, we thought we could use some of the standard mail tools, right? So as evaluators, we've got a pretty good tool bag there. An example of that would be we developed a mail matrix. So we thought, you know, wouldn't it be good if we could develop this matrix? Everything that needs to be measured is there when it has to be done. That didn't go too well. So it didn't land, it didn't get picked up. And we were scratching our heads, you know, us as evaluators, we thought that would be pretty useful and a kind of standard part of our practice. But I think, one, it was pretty overwhelming because we tried to put everything in there, but also the timing wasn't right. And also there was a little bit of prior experience with evaluation hadn't necessarily been successful with some of the team that we're working with. So the learning there is that tools are only one part of the story. So yes, some of our tools are useful. We have to use them in the right way at the right time. But also we realized that not only timing, but also mindsets are a pretty critical aspect. So mindset could be in terms of what's being valued at a particular time, what's being valued more or less than other things that we could pay attention to. So the other thing is, how do we balance things in impact investing? As you probably know, you're trying to balance the financial with the impact, social impact, environmental impact. That's always a kind of delicate thing, because we're trying to really make sure that the impact side gets sufficient attention. And this valuing and mindset issue changes between players. So it changes between the different people that we're working with here, but it also varies according to the stage of development. So we tried to work earlier on with the investees, which are early stage innovators essentially. And we found that the timing of that engagement is crucial as well. So we initially had a few false starts because the ventures just weren't ready to either think or dedicate time and resources to impact measurement. So we pulled back, we waited, we paused, we waited till they were ready to engage again, and further down the track, it worked a lot better. So we've learned a lot from that. So we had to get the right focus, the right timing, the right tools, and also make sure that the mindsets were in the right place. And this year has also been really challenging with the COVID situation, because previously to that, we were able to have regular in-person sessions and engagement, particularly with the fund team. And what we found there was that, and this will be no surprise, I'm sure, to people, but being in a room together and having an extended time period for discussion, etc., and that blending of informal with formal ways of working. For us, that resulted in much faster progress. So we were able to cover a lot more ground, cover it in more depth, and actually make leaps of progress. So what we found here, well, I mean, you know, evaluation, but DE in particular, is clearly a social as well as a technical process. So, you know, if we focus too much on the technical and ignore the social, it's not going to work. And I guess the other way around, if we just socialize without using our evaluation techniques, that wouldn't work either. So basically, we've really missed the in-person opportunities. So with the doing D remotely, I'll hand over to Dominic because he's going to say more on that and what they've learned too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Penny, and everyone. And to reintroduce myself again, I'm Dom Margiata. I'm a program associate at Social Impact, where I have been for over the last 4 years, and in that same amount of time have been fortunate enough to collaborate with Heather and many others working on supporting DEs across various sectors, regions, and focuses. And just this past year, in late 2020, early 2021, USAID Indonesia and their active developmental evaluation called Jalan funded Social Impact to undertake a larger learning about on how remote DEs have been and can continue to be successful in what they do. And that effort culminated in our remote DE guide, which is available on the deck, where I have sourced the information for this presentation from. And I'm happy to share that with you all now in the chat, and happy to answer any and all questions you have about that or on remote DE generally. And to start off with, the buckets, the categories of common challenges that remote DEs face are really aligned with all the different phases of the DE itself, and whether they're in person or not, and fall into and can be described as the embeddedness side, both technically having access to systems, emails, appropriate clearances, but also the behavioral elements of a team's both formal and informal processes and routines. Trust, similar to buy-in, to build a transparent relationship where everyone involved acknowledges and ideally appreciates the value that DE brings. Engagement, which once trust and buy-in are established and an evaluator is embedded, the handling of the day-to-day execution of both the DE and the work of the teams themselves. Data collection, self-explanatory, and deliverables and learning products, which DEs, we produce them throughout, not necessarily only at the end, and it is a very iterative process, but it is the culmination of the work of all these phases getting to that point. And how we get to that point, you know, these are the challenges that we see across the board in D, especially remote DE, but all DE. So next slide, Heather, please. You know, key considerations for anyone who is deciding on whether or not to do a remote DE. And a lot of it aligns with what, you know, Kareem and Penny were talking about, considerations for obviously impact investing DE, but broadly applicable, you know, structure, focus, cost, you know, timeline. Obviously, we live in a world where there are a lot of remote platforms right now. We're on Zoom right now, but does a team or an organization prefer Microsoft or Google or other platforms for how to connect with each other, hold meetings, presentations, etc.? And it's important. I think a common theme that comes up across remote DEs especially is being able to understand the informal elements of a team, the cues, the virtual water cooler, so to speak. Where does that happen, if at all, in a remote team environment? And if so, how will you be able to collect data on it? What additional methods outside of the existing systems your teams are using will you be able to use in order to collect that data and analyze it to present a usable product for your client? And it's also worth noting here, not formally listed in the guide, but a very important theme is whether or not there are champions, people who are willing to advocate on behalf of the DE to help acculturate it, help embed the evaluator and however many support staff there are. Very important to consider when deciding on whether or not to move forward, because they will make the buy-in process, that trust building and embedding process, so much easier for you. And just moving on to the next slide briefly to round it all out. We found, as part of the process of putting this guide together, we interviewed 6 DEs that either have successfully completed or are still successfully ongoing in the remote environment, in the remote pandemic environment that we have lived in. And the general theme of the successes would really speak to the core of what DE is. And if Michael Quinn Patton were here right now, we'd like to think he would be proud of this, because we're trying to build a utilization focused evaluation, something that not only exists and occupies that space day to day, but creates a tangible product and that is applied and sustained thereafter. And we've seen all 6 DEs, and there are also more out there that we'd like to hear from, be able to not only just survive in the remote pandemic environment, but really thrive, be able to collect data, find new ways to collect data, and present new insights that have helped their clients in ways that they carry on to this day, everywhere from the UN to USAID, private healthcare facilitators in East Africa, everywhere in between have found ways to use the information that DE provides as a long-term value gained for them. And in general, as we transition hopefully out of the pandemic, whenever that is, teams can consider undertaking a remote DE, even if the in-person option is available, because they present select advantages, most importantly in terms of cost in all phases, without having to have the corporate real estate office space to physically embed in, and the travel associated to go meet with stakeholders to collect data. And also, we found that the process of data collection in and of itself is more collaborative and more at the heart of what DE has designed itself to be at its core, a more inclusive, involved process for everybody involved in a way that's very easy, quick and easy to send a quick text, quick social media message, to follow up, to get more information, to be more iterative, again, at what the heart of DE was always supposed to be. And cost, data collection, being able to engage with a broader audience. If you're saving money, if you're, even if you're starting with an in-person DE and transitioning to remote, that those cost savings can be used to engage a larger audience, collect more data over a longer period of time, and really at the end of the day, stay focused, stay on task with what the DE scope of work you were assigned was to do. It is a lot harder to be pulled in different directions and get off topic with remote DEs that we found compared to in person. So obviously the process is not completely flawless. It's not, the easiest thing, but it can be done, and it can be done well. And we're happy to continue promoting that message and encouraging more DE implementation, however possible, moving forward in the world. And yeah, like I said, happy to answer any and all questions you have about that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Heather.
Great, thank you. So to round out these presentations where we talked about using DE in impact investing and then using DE in a virtual environment when DE really wasn't initially set up to do that, and we've all adjusted to COVID life, I wanted to share some potential research questions and methods that could be used to study DE in new environments. WDI is leading an ongoing evaluation, testing the effectiveness of developmental evaluation in the USAID context. And this work is part of DEPA-MERL, which is a consortium of partners, including Social Impact, Search for Common Ground, and the William Davidson Institute. And this is all through USAID's PPL group. On our website, you'll find guides tailored to funders and implementers on how to implement DE case studies, as well as reports on each of the DEs. I'm going to paste that in the chat as another resource for everyone to take a peek at in your own time. The research questions that we're answering are part of these work, as I mentioned, could be useful to others interested in assessing how DE is working in new environments. The first question in the first row here is, how is developmental evaluation able to capture, promote, and enable utilization of emergent learnings in blank environment? And it's a valuable question to answer because it helps provide evidence of the impact of the DE in a particular environment. And that's helpful for people that are trying to understand what is DE, what kind of impact can it have. This is a really helpful question to kind of track on, especially in a new environment where you're trying to convince others of the value of DE. So to answer this question, we use outcome harvesting. In outcome harvesting, researchers collect or harvest evidence of what's changed in a program, and then working backwards determine whether and how an intervention has contributed to those changes. So we used outcome harvesting to assess how each of the DEs we were studying captured, promoted, and enabled utilization of emergent learnings in different USAID pilots, DE pilots. And this allowed us to examine how individual outcomes contributed to system-wide changes. The data sources for this included an event log where the developmental evaluator tracked major and minor events throughout the DE. WDI used that log to inform the focus of monthly interviews we conducted with the developmental evaluator. And after each monthly interview, we draft 1 to 2 outcomes, and the descriptions of the outcomes included the developmental evaluator's contribution to the outcome and the significance of that outcome to the program. Those descriptions, those outcome descriptions, were reviewed quarterly, so they could be updated with new information. And at the end of each DE, we would hold multiple meetings with the developmental evaluator to edit and finalize all the outcome descriptions before substantiation. And we substantiated, we didn't substantiate all outcomes, but we chose to substantiate those that we could include where outcomes where the DE captured, promoted, or enabled utilization of learnings, and by verifying a subset of outcomes that the remaining harvested outcomes would automatically be validated or indirectly substantiated, given the interconnection between those outcomes and a certain theme. Semi-structured interviews were conducted with substantiators to verify the accuracy of the outcomes. And then after those substantiation interviews, we determined the substantiator's level of agreement with each outcome description and contribution of the DE to the outcome. And we also incorporated any new data that came up during those substantiation interviews. And at that point, DEPA-MERL reviewed and we re-verified each updated outcome for accuracy. And then what was neat, once we had all these verified and substantiated outcomes, we could categorize them into different types of outcomes. So we could look at the types of changes the outcome was related to. Was it a strategy change the DE created? Was it something around knowledge management, et cetera? We also categorized by the role of the DE. Was the DE just contributing by capturing information, or did it promote information use, or did it utilize some of the information from the DE, as well as the orientation of the change, if it was positive or negative. The second question that we answered was, what are the barriers and enablers to implementation of developmental evaluation in blank environment, in that case, USAID's environment? And this is an important question to answer because it can inform learning and future DE implementation in that particular environment. We used monthly interviews with the developmental evaluator to probe into barriers and enablers for the DE over the previous month. And we also conducted interviews with other stakeholders at the end of the DE to capture additional barriers and enablers. And then we coded and analyzed interview summaries and transcripts from the monthly interviews using NVivo. And finally, the third question that we looked at was, what do key informants consider to be the value added or lost of conducting a developmental evaluation compared to traditional evaluation approaches in this environment? And that question, I think, is helpful for others to also look at in new environments, is because it can help provide data, and you can have quantitative data here too. It can help provide data to help with marketing or increasing buy-in within a particular DE environment, because you're basically surveying everyone that participated in the DE and understanding, did they like it? What did they think the pros and cons were compared to other evaluation approaches? You get some great quotes, you get some nice findings quantitatively that you can then share back with others within an organization that will help maybe make the case for DE, or maybe help you understand that DE may not be right for a particular environment. So as I mentioned, we answered that question by sending a survey to DE stakeholders to assess their satisfaction with the DE compared to more traditional evaluation approaches. And we used Qualtrics to administer that survey. And with that, I'll share some of those resources that give more details on our methods for answering those 3 research questions, but we'd love to open it up to Q&A with everyone. I'm gonna stop the screen share so we can look at each other's faces. And there's been a number of questions that have come in through the chat. And I think we've done, for my tracking before I started talking, some of these questions have been answered pretty well in the chat, but Margaret, I don't know if everyone's been following along in the chat either, but just to be fair, Margaret had asked, how do we get government funders to understand the need for this shift? And we talked about, some people responded in the chat, Courtney and others, saying that having some examples and cases can go a long way. I'll just add to that that USAID, the work with DEPA Merle and USAID has contributed a lot of cases as well. So I will, especially on the government side, I want to see if anyone else wants to add something from our speakers, or if Margaret, you have something else you'd like to add to the question, given how it's evolved. I see a no from Margaret's face. Okay. There was also a question about who pays for DE in the market-based approach, and there was a lot of back and forth here. Is there any follow-up anyone would like to go on here before we go to the next question?
Maybe I'll just jump in, Heather.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an open question, both I think in impact investing, but also in DE. And this question of how do we articulate the value of DE, I think is something we all have to get better around. On one hand, we've talked a lot about the ways of working, and can feel and looked soft, if that's the right word. On the other hand, there are also very tangible products and tools and approaches. So I actually think part of the beauty of DE is that balance, that it's about influencing and nudging and shifting and catalyzing certain behaviors, but it's also about the products, quite tangible, quite specific, quite tactical, and visible. Sometimes some of those things are viewed by different actors more than others. And that's one of the challenges of DE, particularly when you recognize that good DE actually requires a lot of space to both be proactive as well as reactive. And I think one of the things we had going for us is that the Laudes Foundation, both as an investor, but also in their goals as a field builder, in terms of trying to think about how DE could be applied, allowed for that kind of flexibility. And you had a very receptive fund team that also put in the time and the work. The cadence of meetings that Penny outlined in terms of bi-weekly monthly, quarterly, is actually quite unusual in other funds. This is a bit of an outlier. And the fact that they are making this kind of time commitment when they've got lots of other things to do, I think is at least one signal of commitment. But we also see other things that happen in between those meetings that demonstrate that. So I think the other lesson in market context is that there are different ways to think about who brings what to the table, how do we signal a level of commitment, the value of DE in informing decisions, and then thinking about more the classic domains around evaluation, including products and reporting. Penny, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, because I think this is still one of the live areas in terms of we haven't yet fully figured out what's the funding model. And on the other hand, this hybrid of philanthropic and market approaches almost requires a blended funding approach as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of the value question, we've had feedback on the D work we're doing, both from the fund, which has acknowledged what they've appreciated about the DE, but also from the work we've been doing in investees. And there was a question actually earlier up, I think probably during when I was talking about what I talked about the timing of engaging with investees, and someone put a question up about what are the factors that affect investee engagement. And I think, just a couple of quick things. We've been working with, they're either startups or early stage ventures, and early on in the piece, they're so focused on business development and ensuring their survival that actually they don't really have the headspace or the time to engage deeply in DE type activities. Now that might not hold true for all ventures, but for the ones that we've been working with. And the other thing is that they have quite low capacity early on in the piece. So that low capacity means the time simply isn't available to spend on the kinds of engagements that we were hoping that they would. But I should also say that we've been working also on a side project, which is a research project on what the pathways look like in impact measurement for the ventures. But we'll be able to share something, I hope, Karim, early next year on that. So we've been working on what does this look like for ventures, basically.
Great, thanks, Penny, for picking up Sasha's question. The next question we had was if one of the speakers could briefly explain what were the unique aspects of the DE carried out for this specific case, which were distinct from evaluation in general, or has DE been used in the same way as general evaluation approach? And I can kick it off by my experience and then let my presenters jump on in. Usually what we see in the DEs we've done with USAID is that developmental evaluation is separate from the regular evaluation activities. The people will still have their performance evaluations, their impact evaluations, but developmental evaluation has an entirely different focus and purpose within the program that it's working. I'll turn it over to Karim, Penny, and Dom if they want to add anything else.
I would just say in our experience, I think when we started this 4 years ago, this was the first time that DE was applied in a, at least an impact investment fund context. I'm sure that Jane, Veronica, or others could chime in at what's happened since then, because there's been more in a range of market-based contexts. The other thing is that, as Penny said, partly when we started, we tried to adapt some of the tools of how we've used DE before. Penny and I first started working on DE, I think, on a joint project over 10 years ago. One of our colleagues, Laura Fischler, is here too. So it's interesting that we try to take some of what we learned from philanthropy and adapt it, as Penny said, somewhat successfully, but also unsuccessfully in a markets context. And I think the differences are shorter feedback loop, the fact that it's applied in an investment context. There's also a different understanding of what impact is across the different stakeholders. Unpacking the relationship between financial outcomes or success and impact outcomes of success is not always straightforward. And the fact that a lot of this felt new in terms of the ways of working and posing a set of learning questions around the learning agenda we had. So I think there's some similarities, but also a lot of differences there. And Penny, I don't know if there's anything else that I've missed that you would add around that distinction around the market context versus how we have applied it previously in philanthropy?
Just 2 words, really. It's harder.
Great, thanks. I'm looking at our time, and I do want to close with a question for each of the presenters. But first, I wanted to pick up on a question that Jane asked about wondering if there's a community or practice for us that are using DE and impact investing, evaluation, or impact measurement management. And Courtney mentioned that there's a group supported by the McConnell NOE building a community of practice for DE. I also see Michael Quinn Patton. We're graced to have you here and very happy to see you. Blue Marble Evaluation, I think, is another great community to get involved with and following. But if anyone else has other ones that they want to share in the chat, I think all of us are seeking to join these different communities so we can continue these types of conversations. The question I'd like, and sorry, just also say that I know there's more questions we're not able to get to at this point, but we will follow up with those that have open questions and shoot you an email afterwards to answer your open questions. But I do want to end with a question for the presenters, and I'd love if others on the call also respond via the chat function. And I'd like to ask, what's one thing that you'll take away from today's discussion? And again, please fill in the chat and answer yourself too, because we've got a lot of great participants today. And I'll go ahead and start in the order we went. And if that means Karim, can we start with you?
Sure, thanks. And there's something we didn't spend too much time on, but I would say that our experience has validated the fact that the evaluator's toolkit, particularly around evaluative thinking, can be applied successfully in market-based approaches. It does require a little bit of work, as Penny said. It might feel harder, but I think we have a lot to offer a world that is increasingly looking for this kind of skill set and broad toolkit.
And over to Penny. What's one thing?
Yeah, really, just to say that what I'm taking away from this is that there's a lot of interest in this, in applying DE in these new and different contexts. So I think that's great, and I think to me it would be good to have more conversations.
And Dom?
Yeah, definitely echoing everyone else's sentiments here, and would also just add quickly to say hello and thank you to Michael Quinn Patton, and would also echo that the Blue Marble Evaluation is a great community of practice that helped us launch our remote DE guide, and we want to stay connected moving forward. But yeah, it's been a really great experience for me just to see the continued level of interest, and how broad the field of DE continues to expand, how broadly, and how many diverse people and organizations have a vested interest in DE and could really benefit from what it can offer. And I think we're all really excited about what the future holds, whether we stay more remote or not, or hybrid, everything in between. I think DE will largely mirror the response of how the world turns in terms of how we work and where we do it and how. So I think we're all very excited for that, and yeah, that we'll see what happens.
Thank you. And I'll add, I'm encouraged by the ability, the learnings that we're hearing about adapting DE or applying it in new environments like impact investing. I think that's a prime place for DE to be utilized, and I'm very excited to see more of that in the future. And it's great to see that we've been able to adapt DE into the virtual environment over this past year and a half, because we've kind of been forced to. But I'm really encouraged by this, and I'm very excited to follow along as we all continue applying DE in some new environments. Well, thank you, everyone. We will follow up with the questions we weren't able to get to in this period.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all. Take care.